Welcome everyone to this edition of the AANA Reset Now forum webinar. This session's topic is optimizing your media spend during a recession, and obviously the choice of the word recession, albeit controversial, is very deliberate. Clearly it's a highly relevant topic, one that is getting lots of opinions because there are so many unknowns that marketers and their agency partners are facing right now. For example, in a meeting with the WFA last night, their latest figures, which were very recent from last week, amongst their global members, are indicating that overall we're likely to see a 30% fall in marketing spend for the calendar 2020. Obviously lots of different surveys going around. But I think most importantly is that 62% of those respondents were basically saying they were now switching from short-term focus to a long-term focus. So what that signals is clearly the immediacy of the crisis is over, and global marketers are now looking to the future and what that means in terms of returning to growth through recovery. These are obviously very fluid times, and certainty as a concept is in drought. It's safe to say that the only thing we know today is that the future, whether it's in 3 months, whether it's in 6 months, or even a year, is unknown and unknowable. So brands are trying to deal with this uncertainty, and over the past few weeks, I know that many AANA members have been involved with multiple sets of different contingency and risk mitigation plans. But today, most are now turning their attention to how to get back onto this path to growth. The paradox of this change, of course, is that there is no reduction in the number of potential scenarios and marketing plans that marketeers are being asked to develop. But the AANA and the presenters on this session today would like to help you with that. We can help by sharing with you what's happening now, not just within Australia, but from around the world. Shortly, I'll invite Mike Campbell, Ubiquity's Head of International Effectiveness, and Peter Cornelius, of course, many of you who you know, MD for Ubiquity here in Australia and New Zealand, to share their findings, their insights and advice on how to put your brand back on this path to recovery. And as you know, I always like to capture the perspective of a practicing marketer. So I'll invite Carl Winter, formerly CMO at Myer, Officeworks and latterly Ozpost, and now advisor of one of the country's top 5 advertisers, to give us his candid advice on some of the options open to marketers. This is simply a take it or leave it offer. Unlike a lot of other commentary available to us, we believe there is no silver bullet. There is no one way or one answer. What we do believe is that in coupling the understanding and mining of consumer behavior for insights with the core fundamental skills of marketing, these together will provide answers for all. It's as simple as that. So let's start sharing some of those insights with you. Mike, if I can now hand over to you, and of course, Peter.
Good afternoon. Good morning for me, obviously, but good afternoon to you all in Australia. I'll quickly take you through I want to go through some of the economic indicators and the impact on media. This, as John has already alluded to, this long-term versus short-term, brand versus performance media element. And I want to take you some lessons through of advertising in a recession. I'm very conscious that you haven't had a recession in Australia. You've got the longest run since '91 of not having a recession. I'm getting on a bit and lived through a few, so I'm kind of aware of what happens. We'll go through some of the data sets and the evidence as to essentially what works or the benefit of advertising through a recession. I'll say one thing up front though. There are some very good academic arguments to advertise through a recession. If you are in a company that is majorly struggling to pay its staff and chasing cash, or in that place, it's probably not the place to take some of these slides and talk with your CEO and CFO. If it is that stark at that time, so you're probably, for want of a better phrase, going to get punched in the face. But the academic arguments are there if you're in a position where those choices can be made. And we'll finish off with some recommendations before I hand over to Carl. So the first and obvious thing that's happened, and okay, this is the UK ad, there'll be the equivalent in Australia, of course, is that initially you're looking at the content. Some of the creatives are inappropriate appropriate. They don't have the social distancing. I think for KFC, finger licking good was not appropriate, and certain adverts have been pulled. It should be said on the content, and I think Carl will talk a little about this as we go through at the end, is that it's important not to sort of lose focus, in my view. We do a lot of work at Ubiquity about the importance of distinctive assets or fluent devices, if you like, so those recognition points for brands. Though you're advertising or recutting advertising, it's important to have that there. There was a Mark Ritson article in Marketing Week, I don't know if you've seen it, there's a montage of ads that fundamentally beautifully shot, but they all look the same. And the Kantar data is saying, you need to have those distinctive assets or be saying something different to cut through the clutter of advertising. And most recently, loads of adverts from iPhones. Again, which one is which? They're all looking pretty similar. So remembering, the core fundamentals of what works in advertising and having those fluent devices there. The other thing is brands that are making a difference to the effort that can help cut through that effort. Actually, the British Airways ad in the UK at the moment, yes, it's got the sonic devices that you associate with the airline, but it's also got, we're helping the NHS, and again, there'll be equivalents in Australia. And we've got some examples here, but sometimes it's what you do as a brand. Marks and Spencer's helping the war effort. It's had a major impact on the perception of that company, for many decades to come after the event. So let's have a quick look at some of the indicators. I was looking through your own press, and it looks like that there is unanimity around the perception of going into recession. And certainly, if you look on the right, we've got some of the major economies there, US, UK, world, and it's certainly looking in 2020 that a significant recession and way beyond what we've seen in past recession cycles. But the anticipation at the moment, I know a lot of debate that there is an expected bounce back in 2021, so let's hope that that happens. The one thing that we know from past recessions, and this could be taken from pretty much any economy, is if you've got the gross domestic product, the fortunes of the economy at large, going up and down through time, then actually the swings in the media cycle and media expenditure go way higher and way lower. And as we've already seen, because we've got the added impact of lockdown, we're getting -30, -40% in some economies, but certainly -30 is the sort of Q2 figure for Australia. This is a chart, I think it's probably the one that John alluded to in the intro from the WA. It just came out, I think it was last week, but looking at the budgets for the full year and for the half year. So you've got, -40%, -46% in LATAM for the half year, but for the full year, sort of well down. And the APAC figure on the end there, we're looking at a full year figure for 2020 of -29%. I will hand over to Peter, because just to introduce, we have done an Ubiquity survey. We've boosted the sample in Australia, and some very interesting findings there. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, just click down again. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Just to provide some context, as John mentioned at the start of the intro, everybody seems to be doing surveys. So we've also done a survey. We've in fact done a couple of surveys. This is the second wave. But given that we were having this AANA session, we thought we'd make it very pertinent and having a nice up-to-date survey. So this actually goes up to Friday of last week. So hot off the press. In terms of the responses, we had some 17 different brands, and they came from categories of FMCG, beverages, retail, finance, technology, so very widespread. Overall, represented some $350 million of Australian spending across the year, and hardly surprisingly, what we found was that 93% of those clients were planning to reduce their media budget for the rest of the year. And in terms of that drop, they were forecasting some 32% of a reduction. I've seen similar figures quoted in other surveys, so that seems to be about the norm and certainly was pretty much consistent with the WFA survey. What they're all saying also is that come Q4, whilst they're still recording reductions, the belief is that the reductions will be slowing as we start to get back into a recovery, as Mike alluded to, in 2021. And what is consistent across nearly half, 40% of those brands, they're all placing very high importance on share of voice and maintaining that share of voice through this downtime. So these are our results compared to the globe average. Across the world, we had some 101, 102, I think it was, brands participate in the survey. You can see there that the weighted average is at 32% for us in terms of those declining, saying they're going to decline, whereas the global figure is 25%. Interestingly, on the right-hand side, to put a bit more of a positive slant on things, some are actually saying still increasing budgets, and certainly across our client base, it's not all doom and gloom. We are seeing some indications of recovery, and certainly even over the last couple of weeks off the back of some of the relaxation of our self-isolation guidelines from the government, certainly across our client base, and talking to some of the agencies, there are early signs of perhaps a faster recovery than what this survey is indicating, which, if that is the case, will be a good thing for us all. Next one. And it's kind of indicated in this survey. So on the left-hand side, answering the two questions, how do you see your budget phasing through the rest of the year? Come Q4, you can see some clients actually listing increases in that period. And on the right-hand side, certainly across Q2, 3 and 4, the big whack that we all saw and the industry saw was in Q2, which was some 35%. And that's pretty much backed up with the SMI data that's been reported. That then starts to tail off to 22% in Q3. And by the time we get into Q4, minus 11%. I'd like to think as we get closer to that period and potentially doing more surveys, and certainly anecdotal feedback from some of our clients, that I'd like to think we'll actually come out of this a bit quicker, and certainly in the Australian market, so some green shoots of recovery in that period. From a media perspective, from a channel perspective, where do they see the movements coming from? Each of those clients were asked to respond to that. As can be seen across the blue and the red being increases, the dark grey, blue colour is decrease. As you can see that they were forecasting increases, particularly across e-commerce and earned media PR areas. Where they were forecasting the greatest decreases was in their traditional media spends of brand and performance type metrics, which Mike will cover through his process of how to recover through a recession. Next one. We talked about share of voice in terms of the highlights. What was very consistent was that almost 50% of those clients were saying that if we are advertising through this period, it is super important to maintain that share of voice presence, so that when we do come out of it and start to improve, you're starting off from a much stronger starting point. And the other interesting point, which is not really surprising given the amount of turmoil in the marketplace, is that even more so than usual, those clients, and some 70% of them, were saying that they were relying very heavily on data and insights being driven by research to be making decisions from. So stay tuned for more. And the recession slide, Mike referenced us in terms of Australians being very proudly saying we haven't had too many recessions. It's actually a really interesting graph. So we're second from the top. It was actually July 1990 that was the last recession we had. And for those historians amongst us, the famous Paul Keating line, who was the treasurer at the time, saying that was the recession we had to have. And this was a couple of years after his previous famous quote that's still referenced, that we had the danger of becoming a banana republic because we were drowning under massive debt. So interestingly, as off our concessions that the government has made and some of the initiatives being put in place where we're going back into massive debt, it'll be interesting to see how we come out of it. But certainly, yeah, from a point of view of how do we trade through a recession, it's not something that many of us are used to, and certainly I'd imagine a lot of the marketers on the call have never had to experience circumstances as we are doing now, because it's obviously new for all of us. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Peter. So let's review some of the evidence for the pros and cons of advertising in a recession. First thing, there's some reference there about share of voice versus share of market. Given the jobs that I have in analysing data and media data, actually this whole relationship that is so often quoted of share of voice, share of market kind of irks me a bit, because it's not a brilliant relationship, but nonetheless it is a relationship that holds true. If it was a perfect relationship, we would assume that all brands have equally strong content and equally correct channel mix, and that just isn't the case, and that's what we want to go on to in a moment. But it's certainly the case overall that if you are advertising and your competitors aren't, you will gain. And it's certainly true that if you can't advertise and your competitors are advertising or even increasing their advertising, you will lose. So that's the overall relationship. And just some data on this. This is from the PIMS database. It's if you're not aware of this, it's a data set. It covers about 750 consumer businesses. They combine the financial form, the financial function of the business together with their marketing spend and ad spend. And they cut it. It's widely used by the St. Gallen Business School, actually. A lot of the analysis on this in Switzerland. But this is looking at businesses or brands that have cut during recessions, and there's a sort of pre-2000 and post-2000 slice on this. Those that have maintained their spend and those that have increased. And this is looking at the share gain in the first 2 years after recovery. What you can see is those that are increasing, if you look at post-2000 in particular, where it's more exasperated, there's a 2-point share gain on average for those that have increased and increased their share of voice within that, and those that have cut their spending significantly, there's a loss in share. If you look through the other evidence, it's not in here, it typically takes about 5 years and a more expensive route for brands to recover that share loss, and that's why it's so important. And if you ask the question, well, what's the sort of return on capital employed, the sort of ROI, if you like, the return on capital expenditure of those that have cut, maintained, or increased, it's a more profitable route if the investment is there to increase your investment, and it is significantly more profitable. Bearing in mind, the share gain is easier, the media costs are lower during a recession. There's a lot of pros to getting this right, but critically to that, as long as you've got the right content. One of the reasons behind this is if you think about the impact of advertising, then it doesn't all happen in the short term. Usually, if you're thinking about this sort of hours and days after the deployment of media, that's typically about 18% of the overall impact. And that's usually the domain of digital attribution models measuring that. If you're looking at what I would call the short to medium term of weeks and months, perhaps up to 6 months, that accounts typically, and it varies by category, but typically less than half of the overall impact of advertising. That is what marketing mix modeling looks at. But if you think about that, if the rest of it is in the long term, then when we're thinking about this sort of this ongoing, short-term advertising, long-term advertising, brand versus performance, then the tool of marketing mix modeling actually biases against the brand building work. I'll touch on that in a second. What we are seeing, again, this is recent Kantar data, just some of the brand metrics showing significant decline. Problem is, if you're arguing that with your CFO and your CEO and say, well, my mentions has declined, it will be regarded as one of those fluffy metrics in marketing. You know, if you're in the banking sector and you say your trust metric is declined or whatever is critical to your sector, if that link to the P&L and sales isn't there, it's not a strong argument. Just to make one point, and I'll just cover this quickly, is that some of the modelling that we're doing at Ubiquity, we do link the different media types through all of the brand tracking statements. So you do what you call a pathways model, saying this impacts this, that impacts this, that ultimately impacts your baseline or your underlying trend of your brand. So it is possible to quantify, but it's not the norm in the industry. Now, where we have quantified them, this is an example of Direct Line Group, which is the UK's top insurer, but we've done this in many industry verticals. If you want to read more on this, it actually won a gold in the last round of the IPA Effectiveness Awards. I know that Mark Ritson, kind of one of our own and one of your own, sort of picked up on this big article that you can Google as well. But we looked at the, we modelled the brand campaigns around new propositions or brand-led campaigns, and also some of the discounting campaigns. The light blue on there is the short-term impact. So that's, you know, within months of the deployment. And what you can see actually is that they're pretty similar. You know, the impact on their business is pretty similar. But if you look at that long term, you look at those pathways and look at how it's impacting the underlying growth of their base of sales, what you can see is that their brand campaigns are significantly outperforming the discounting campaigns. So there is a way of tying those metrics in, but this goes to the proof of that brand versus performance media. And there's lots of sort of marketing academia around this. You can read this for yourself, but you know that taking a shift in promotional spending upwards tends to decrease the ROI through time. This is some work I was involved in many years ago. This is from a study called, it's a meta study of about 3,500 brands in the US, but it was looking at the impact of discounting actually on the advertising response or TV response at the time. And what you can see, point to the right-hand side of this chart, if you're aggressively discounting, then actually it does dilute your advertising response at the same time. One other thing quickly to allude to is a lot of writers would actually point to the fact that the biggest economic benefit of advertising is not the short-term impact on sales, but your ability to hold a price premium in the market above the generic brands in the market. Now, it's not often that as the sort of marketing analyst and econometrician that you get experiences of big brands that have advertised consecutively year in, year out at similar levels and then just go dark, which effectively would be the sort of precedent for the recession that we have here. Doing some work many years ago with Diageo, and they're doing a sort of portfolio allocation of the budget across Europe. And one of the impacts of that is that they continued to advertise Gordon's alongside the Europe-wide gin trend at the time. And actually they stopped all spend on Bell's whiskey, which is the #1 blended whiskey in the UK market. Essentially for the first year, it seemed to make very little difference, but it started to creep in after 12, 18 months that it was Bell's was starting to sort of hemorrhage as a brand. Gordon's obviously where they'd increased the spend, was increasing. Now, I'll just look at these figures here. I know this is an economic term when you talk about price elasticity. So it's the price sensitivity of the brand to price change. But just to convert that into just regular English, it's the perception of the substitutability of brands. So if you get more price elastic, more price responsive, then consumers think they can substitute your brands more readily into other brands and you lose volume. Now, what happened here is that when Bell's on the right reduced their ad spend or stopped their ad spend, their price elasticity rocketed and they were no longer able to sustain that price premium, and actually they lost the #1 slot of that sector of the market to Famous Grouse. So, but the profit impact of that is typically larger when you see it versus the actual uplift in sales from the advertising. So a number of points there, but going dark is only a short-term fix. It takes a long time to recover from it. And again, this sort of the price premium argument that isn't often talked about often has the biggest economic impact. So moving on from that, our recommendations to brands. First thing is, if you've got econometric models, go back to the provider and simulate at the moment what the right course of action is. Basically, behind econometric models, you've got marketing response curves, and you can do the optimization saying you're better spending more on this more efficient channel versus this one, and you can build the future-facing optimizations. But clearly, those response curves behind the scenes are impacted by the media costs. So if you've got 30% deflation in TV currently in Q2, I know that will, sort of, some of that deflation will reduce in the market, then it will make certain media channels significantly more attractive. Just to talk about these response curves, and apologies for a sort of maths lesson, well, it's a Janet and John maths lesson, I say at the end of the day, but essentially we all know that as you invest on the left-hand side here, unfortunately you don't get a linear response with sales. Reach flattens out for different media channels, you start to hit people again and again, and actually you get what you get on the right, which is that diminishing response curve. Now, essentially when we're talking about optimization of how this works, is that if you're spending too much on certain channels that have limited reach, then you will saturate more quickly. And the art of the optimization is to say, well, in this case, if these are all media channels A, B, and C, you can benefit the brand by taking spend out of channel C and putting it into channel A. But again, as I said before, all of these curves will have changed depend on the inflation deflation in the market that Ubiquity has access to, and no doubt is put through the AANA as well back to the membership. Now, what's interesting is that this is from the WFA survey that John talked about as well. That the expectation is that some of the online display, online video, in terms of the reduction in spend, is expected to be fairly minimal, whereas some of the channels, some of them are obvious, the reductions. You're going to get less outdoor if you're in lockdown, it goes without saying. But when you're talking about the big deflation in TV, that's surprising at the moment from the sort of logic of how you would do the optimization. I'll remind you, just going back to the Australian data, Ubiquity did some work, the Think TV work. I've just taken one chart from this, which is all categories, because actually we did split it down to FMCG, auto, banking, and then e-commerce. The e-commerce picture doesn't look like this, I'll stress. That was the sector where TV wasn't the most efficient and was one of the less efficient channels. But in all others, it was consistent. The TV in Australia, we've just indexed the return on investment performance here versus the most efficient channel, which is TV, and actually is head and shoulders above the rest. Now, at the moment, with 30% deflation in TV, it's going to be even further ahead. So if we're looking from this before, it's saying actually put more into TV, during this recession time, the first few months, you should be putting even more into TV. But what was said on the last chart is that the perception is there'll be a lot more into online display, online video. Now, it actually means that you're focusing channel spend on the least efficient channels. And say there's a lot of stuff that have come out from the ANA, the American, about the value loss in that ecosystem that sort of explains, and the low visibility that explains why those channels don't work nearly as well. So let's build up some points here and say you've got access to the chart at the end. Clearly radio can be quite a good option. There's less drive time radio because there's people working from home, but can add that tone to messaging. But actually putting it in online display typically is not the right answer. The other thing just about brands, I'll go through this quickly, but when you've got the distinctive assets there, I'll take Kit Kat because it's a perfectly international example. When first modelling that for Nestle, the impact of have a break, have a Kit Kat and the bar break effectively doubles the ROI, if you're not aware. So that's why it's used globally. Plenty of examples. There'll be plenty of examples you can talk about, you know, in the Australian market. But if you're going to advertise during this period, say bland ads that, yeah, they can be uplifting, they can be empathetic, they've got to stand out, and they've got to recognise the consumers. So a slide to finish on, just to conclude all of those points. So if you can, don't go dark. If there's the opportunity to see, you know, increase your share of voice, it will, the relationships will hold out, you will benefit as a brand. It's got to be the right content, it's got to be the right channels. And again, you should be monitoring the effectiveness. If you've got work and you've invested in analytics, go back to your provider. If you haven't, we would welcome you having a conversation with us, but if you haven't, go back to your provider and do the simulations on the current media cost forecast of what is the best thing to do. Okay, thank you. I will stop sharing. So hopefully, Carl.
Thank you very much, Mike. That's great. Obviously, some very, very tough choices there for marketers. I'll hand over now to Carl. And Carl, if you want to start sharing your screen, it should pop up.
Thanks, John. Hear me loud and clear?
We can, yep.
Thank you. Here we go. Appreciate that insight, Mike. It was fascinating. Thanks, Peter, as well. We'll just get going there. And John, thanks to you and also the members on the webinar today for tuning in. Really appreciate the opportunity. The brief from John was quite clear in terms of, okay, we all know the theory, but as a marketer, what practical advice would you give to any marketer that you come across in terms of as we're about to embark into this recession? So first of all, just a brief introduction from me. I think John already introduced me, but I've been a senior marketer at my Officeworks and Australia Post and now working as an independent consultant, working with various brands and also advertising agencies and currently working with Bunnings, who I'll refer to some of their activity later in my presentation. Now, I've seen this slide and this quote actually used in multiple presentations, and I really wanted to have a chance to use it, and I never thought I would, but I don't think there's more an apt quote for the period of time that we've been experiencing since mid-March up until now. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. It's fair to say, metaphorically, we've all been punched in the mouth, both as marketers and as humans, both from a health crisis and an economic crisis, by this thing called COVID-19. And you know, every marketer you speak to, they say, well, I had a plan going into this financial year, then COVID-19 hit. And so the big question is, how do marketers respond? And for many marketers, this has basically been the memo. And I think some of the ubiquity data kind of talks to that. So what do? We look to experts, and a lot has been said and a lot has been written. And the common phrase that has been referred to is, don't go dark. Don't let your marketing flame go out. And the reason for that, and I think it was covered off a bit in the ubiquity study, was, I think this quote summarizes it perfectly well. And this is actually from an academic study by Tallis and Tallis, which if you haven't read it, I strongly suggest as marketers you search it out, because it's actually an academic study of all the other academic studies around advertising in a recession, all the way back to the 1920s depression. And the quote from it is, substantial empirical evidence suggests that advertising during a recession leads to increases in market share and sales. Moreover, that effect seems to last beyond the recession. So really that share of voice equals share of market, but you know, beyond the 1 month, 1 year, but into 2 years and 3 years. But I think the ubiquity data and this quote from Marketing Week kind of summarizes it. I took the note that 93% of clients are planning to reduce their budgets. Here, Marketing Week reported only 7% of brands are seizing this opportunity. So we're all very aware of the academic studies. We're aware of the theory of what's going on. Mike talked about being punched in the mouth by the CFO. Well, Les Benate put it this way. He said, this recession really is like no other. This recession will probably be much sharper and deeper than most previous recessions. And the shape of the recovery is actually hard to predict, as we're not sure if it's going to be V shape or a U or an L shape. But telling advertisers to invest for the recovery may be great if they're fighting for their very survival and there is no recovery in sight. I spoke to one marketer who talked about wanting to put forward campaigns and activity to grow share of voice for share of market. And the CFO said to them, well, that's great, but that means we're going to maybe have to lay off about 20 more people. But there's not great arguments to have. So what do marketers do? That was the brief from John. Well, I've got 3 practical tips that I want to get into, but the first one that I really want to, the first caveat overarching those 3 tips is really, as marketers, we need to continue, and I'll say continue, think long and short. We need to believe that we'll come out of this. This is the trend line of the ASX since over the last 110 years. And you can see that there's some massive dips there, be it the depression, be it that recession that Peter referred to, be it the last GFC. But overall, the trend line is up. And we need to believe that although it's hard to, while we're going through it, to sort of see the forest through the trees, but we need to believe that we will come out of this and we will again prosper, have a level of optimism. And so I'll say to continue to think long and short. We're all aware as marketers, or hopefully aware of these graphs, and if not, I suggest you look them out, in terms of balancing between brand and activation. But that's going to be different by sector as we're in this very different recession. If I'm an airline, actually investing in activation right now is almost pointless because I can't actually fly or there's nowhere to fly to. But if I'm a supermarket, getting that right balance between brand and activation is also a different proposition. So for any sector, and I don't profess to know exactly what it is right for your sector, understand that there is still a role to play for long and short advertising, short-term activation and long-term brand building, but address it by sector. That's the overarching caveat that I have to any marketer looking to what to do now. But then these are my 3 tips. These are my 3 frameworks that I would look to in terms of maximizing any investment, be it that it's been reduced or be it that it's increased or be it the same right now for both the long and short term. And I make no apologies that these could seem blatantly obvious. But, you know, in a time of recession when marketing investment could be restricted, that the principles of marketing are no more important when you have those constraints. So with that said, I'm going to start with the first one, which really should always be the mantra of any marketer, and that's to start with the customer. If we think about that customer, there's an amount of data out there in terms of what they're doing and what they're behaving. And I think it's really important to recognize that is because the shifts in customer behavior have been so sizable in a very short period of time. Some big shifts that we usually look to take over weeks or months or even years are happening in days. But with that being said, people are still spending. Yes, there are some winners and losers. And if you're in one of those sectors that is losing, but have a look at some of the sectors that are winning and see if there's any insights in terms of how you can actually tap into that. Going back to some of the core fundamentals that Peter talked about, again, this could be blatantly obvious, but talk about media consumption. This graph is from my friends at Universal McCann, and it's not to talk about the data specifically, but as a marketer, I'd be looking at the data myself or talking to my media agencies about what is actually happening. Not what is happening last month, but what is happening last week. We can see here that linear TV percentage is up. As Ubiquity said, linear TV percentage of consumption is up. As Ubiquity said, actually TV investment is down. I heard that for last week was actually down 10%. So it really is a buyer's market if you're really looking to increase share of voice. Obviously online and TV consumption is going well up, and ad demand is actually going down as marketers start to reduce spend. So really thinking about where you actually want to place your investment as the shifts are occurring on a daily, weekly basis. The next place I'd look at is in terms of customer sentiment. Looking at this is a graph from my friends at AJF, Growth Ops, looking at how they're tracking customer sentiment since mid-March. And you can see that there's really clearly 3 phases. One was the anxiety or unprecedented times phase. The next one was almost the new normal, where a sense of calm, if I use my cursor, calm sort of came over us while we were still in these lockdowns and restrictions. And we see that blue line of calmness actually continuing to increase as we go into hope and green shoots. At this particular time when it's anxiety, I heard a lot of marketers talking about not wanting to be associated with COVID-19 news. Well, if you look at as that sense of new normal and green shoots or that sense of hope, I don't think that that's relevant now. I think, you know, we're in a period where it is part of the news, it's part of daily life. So being associated around that type of content is not particularly an issue. And I get that from looking at these type of graphs. One of the other things that I start to see in terms of, this is from System 1, which is a UK research firm, and I'll refer to some of their advertising research later, that we're really settling in for the long term. This is Australian data that actually says 47% of us really understand or think that the lockdowns of some way, shape or form will go into existence all the way into 2021. If you think about that type of information, that can help you understand where to actually, the type of content and context by which you want your advertising to appear. Again, from System 1, this actually showed that comedy percentage in terms of comedy consumption or people looking for comedy content is actually the highest of all content types, then continuing to increase. We're looking for that light relief. We understand we're in this lockdown for the long haul. We want that light relief. So again, the type of advertising and message that I might use or the type of content that I wanted to be associated with could influence that. And again, Peter might refer to this, but I think having a level of what I'm calling plan flexibility. We've got our plans, but I think we really need to have that flexibility, dare I say agility, as the restrictions start to shift and start to ease. Really, radio and out of home were not great places to advertise while we're in lockdown, but I'm going to say they're great places as we start to come out of those lockdowns, because it really could be a buyer's market. There might not be a lot of demand from advertisers, and overnight we could see, let's just say the restrictions go off overnight, which they won't, but they'll gradually start to ease. Then you'll see a lot more people on the roads. One of the other bits of consumer insight I saw was that we're probably going to try to avoid public transport due to the point of wanting to not be, to actually wanting to social distance from each other. So therefore car, in terms of car rides are actually going to increase. The other area I'd look at in terms of that plan flexibility is looking at as sport comes back on the table and things like cinemas. Again, they could be really good opportunities and a bit of a buyer's market as they start to return to the fold. So that's the first framework, first point of my framework that I'd want to look at as a marketer. The second one is around thinking about acts and ads. And Peter Field, I think, summarised it quite well in one of his recent academic papers, which is, now is a time to demonstrate humanity and generosity in your behaviour, not just your advertising. And customers really are looking to this. This was actually from the Edelman study that said around 2/3 of consumers are actually looking at how brands respond right now. How you behave now may have a bigger impact on your perception than any advertising could. And again, some other survey data from AGF Growth Ops actually ranked some of the supermarkets as responding very well, and some other retailers, but even entities that went into lockdown like the AFL and Qantas have been deemed to be dealing with the crisis quite well, and therefore creating a positive brand perception. Again, this was referenced by Ubiquity, but what Coke did in assisting GIs getting Coke throughout the World War II, or Marks and Spencer in terms of helping get cloth for the English government, and also helping with rationing, actually endeared them, those brands, for generations, not just for years, but for decades to come, that actually helped them to be market leaders for years and years and years. There is a great opportunity in this crisis for brands to do the same. And we're seeing some of that, and there's a multitude of examples, and there's too many to name, but we've seen the supermarkets starting to, this was Iceland in the UK, on the 16th of March were one of the first, and a lot of supermarkets around the world started to copy, was creating hours for elderly people or disadvantaged people to ensure that they got their access to supplies. Last week we saw McDonald's started to give out free food to health workers. NAB and all the other big four banks looking to help customers with furloughing their mortgages, and even 13cabs, which would have gone into going through quite a tumultuous time, looking to actually offer delivery of essential items and pharmaceuticals. So that's really about building brand through useful acts, and that's a great opportunity for brands to do that beyond any advertising investment. The last of my three points in my framework, and again, this could be obvious to any marketer, but I make no apologies for being obvious, because I think these principles really need to apply, is about leveraging your paid, owned, and earned assets. It's something that we all learn at marketing school, but sometimes in the cut and thrust of the day-to-day, we forget about. So first of all, starting with the concept of paid, owned, and earned, which we all should be really familiar with, but then starting with paid. And I think one of the first things that you could probably look at from your paid investment is these type of advertising that say, yes, we are open for business, but we are open for safe business. For example, Domino's talking about contactless delivery, and even Bunnings talking about being able to get in during Easter, but being able to do it safely. So you can't mistake how critical those ads to say, yes, we are open for business. Referencing what is actually working from a paid perspective, I'm going to be talking about System 1 research, which again is a UK advertising firm, and they've looked at what's working and what's not working. I'm going to go into a bit of detail of what is connecting, but first of all, what is not connecting is that direct or hard sell, ads focusing on the brand as opposed to on customers, and actually things that are quite what they call that rely on words and rhythm, almost like a music video. And this is true of both new creative and old creative that existed pre-COVID-19. But let's explore a little bit about what is actually connecting. I'm a huge fan and believer in distinctive assets or fluent devices or codes, whatever you call them. Please use them. With limited investment, now is the time to leverage them more than any other time. And Mike referred to this. It's because that as a lot of marketers responded to the COVID-19 crisis and wanted to give this message of we're in it for you, we all started to look the same. Now, one of the first rules of marketing to generate that mental availability is they must know it's you. So use those distinctive assets you have, because with limited investment, they're going to help, as Mike said, you get the cut through and the ROI that you need. And some of the paid advertising that is working, be it new creative or old creative, are these concepts around celebrating connectedness and betweenness, or a sense of nostalgia. 3 examples here. I'll start with this one because it was an American example, Uncle Ben's rice brand, but they created an ad which was all about connecting over a family meal, but via Zoom. Again, that sense of connectedness, distinctive assets, a sense of nostalgia as we all connected around the family dinner table. We've seen some brands bring back some old creative. We've seen Budweiser bring up the "Was Up" ad, and actually that connected very, very greatly according to System 1's research. But you saw Qantas actually bring back the nostalgia of "I Still Call Australia Home." Just because they're going through hard times and you can't book a flight with Qantas doesn't mean they're not building for the long term in terms of building saliency in the minds of their future customers. And lastly, we're starting to see a bit more optimism and positivity. Going back to that research about we're now moving into that green shoots phase, those type of paid advertisements are really starting to resonate with customers again, according to System 1. And you saw Nike probably looking at this, and they just launched this on Sunday around an ad about being behind the 8 ball and really responding, and you know, an ad filled with hope for a broken world. Moving to owned before earned, but owned, you know, full disclosure, I am doing some work with Bunnings, but not in this area, but I think it's phenomenal that what they did and how quickly they turned around their content development in terms of some of their owned assets. They developed a podcast pretty much in a week, and it's become the #1 gardening podcast in the last month. They've started a DIY live on Instagram, which they're releasing content daily with both influencers and their team members. And, you know, DIY content uploaded on the YouTube channels and sent via email. They really saw that customer insight around DIY, and they leveraged it to the maximum through their owned assets, and some of the responses have been phenomenal. Also, I want to shout out to SATV, which we've seen a lot of tourism brands do this. When you're stuck at home, how do you have a virtual holiday? And they really were the first to do this. And they started in terms of virtual tours of some of their best well-known tourist spots. And just to show that, you know, this stuff does work, there's a graph here that the CMO of SA Tourism posted. They actually showed their visits to their website year on year was 30,000 versus 10,000 in terms of, and that's a good indication or a good lead indicator for hopefully future travel. And again, that 10,000 was when they had paid advertising, the 30,000 was through owned, leveraging their owned assets alone. And last but not least, earned. I think, again, that positivity and optimism in paid can then leverage through earned. And when I saw this, and some of the best examples I saw was the Sofitel. Yes, hotel bookings were down, but again, trying to build that saliency about the type of hotel brand they are. They had a DJ party for all the guests left in lockdown, and Channel 7 News covered it and talked about what a great job the Sofitel Hotel was doing. Campbell Arnott's actually stopped a lot of their paid advertising. Then they wanted to move instead of creating purchase to consumption as they were dealing with supply chain issues. And what they did is they released some of the secret recipes. Not a lot of people went and made the secret recipes, but they got over 240 hits of PR in just a week. And what that really did is really push them to top of mind and actually helped increase both purchase and consumption of their biscuits. And last but not least, I talked about acts, not ads. Well, if you're acting in a positive way, there's no issue in leveraging your acts through earned media and really shouting about it in a way that actually resonates with customers. So that's my framework in terms of the maximize investment now for both the long and short term. Don't forget about the long term as well as maximizing on the short term, but really thinking about media consumption, monitoring consumer sentiment for both content and context, and really having that planned flexibility, having acts and ads, really doubling down on your position, your purpose, whatever you want to call it, and helping build saliency for that through these acts, not just paid investment. Paid, really making sure you're open for business, using those distinctive assets, connectedness and nostalgia, and a sense of positivity and optimism, leveraging your owned assets, it can work, and through earned, having a sense of positivity and leveraging those acts. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity to give that message to your members, and I thank you.
Great, Carl, thanks very much for that. Lots of very rich examples and lots of positivity and hope to take away. I think even when budgets are going to be less this year versus last year, lots of options for marketers to think about.
I would say that, you know, we have been hit in the face and our plans are being thrown out, but we can make new plans. And that's the last message I'll leave you with. There are my contact details. Anyone interested in getting in contact, please hit me up. LinkedIn is probably the best place.
No worries. And guys, we've got a couple of minutes for questions if there are any. I've got one up here, which I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is. I think it goes to you, Mike. Keen to understand the research that shows out of home can't communicate an emotional message. Your thoughts on that, and maybe that's not what we meant, but I'll hand it over to you.
I don't think that's directly what I said, but I mean, obviously, out of home at the moment, a couple of things about it. If there's less people out of home, you're going to get less impacts. So your ability to communicate any message is going to be depleted, of course. The other thing is, I've had so many over my career, so many conversations with out of home companies. Frankly, they don't like econometricians. They believe there is a bias in our models against out of home. It's simply not true. The fact is, if they charge less for it, it would be on a par with other channels on an ROI basis. And that's the only point I would make. Again, you know, there are exceptions that very often they would point to in their pictures of great out of home with great ROIs. If you've got the right content in the right place, it can work. But by and large, it's about 1/10 the efficiency of TV on average. So the idea of sort of putting more money into it. And the other point is a lot of companies are, sort of increasing their digital percentage, or it's mandated by the centre. If it's an international company saying you've got to have so much digital. Digital panels on out of home, they generate about 6 times more money for the out of home companies. And actually, we have never either modelled or done geo-tests to say that digital panels are more efficient. So just under no illusion, it's not working as well. There's less visibility time on screen, particularly if you're driving past. So I'll be
I've just got one question.
Industry of Australia now.
Just a couple of last questions. Quick answer to Victoria. Are we able to get copies of the presentations? The answer is yes. We'll make sure that they are posted to our website, and we'll give you links. Guys, I'd just like to say thank you very much to the presenters, Mike, Peter and Carl. Great content. Thanks very much. And everyone for coming along today. Our next webinar is actually on Monday, which is a Ipsos presentation to the Code of Ethics review that we've been doing on the self-regulatory system, a very, very different topic. but welcome. The welcome is extended to the industry, so please register for that as well if you wish. So thank you very much. I'll say goodbye.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all. Stay safe.
Bye
Thank
all.
you. Thanks, guys.